thanks a lot for being able to discussing the presentation by Jeffrey. I'm a how does it work? I'm actually a big fan of your work. I'm an economist by training, and
your butt is coming.
And no, I mean it's very stimulating to kind of like see a different approach, kind of like really kind of like seeing cities as an organism, maybe as a living organism, and that's something that really got me a lot of thinking about cities, and so I think it's really been very valuable to kind of like not in a way leaving cities just to one discipline, but to kind of like having different views on the same thing, which are I think very complementary. And I think that's really one of the richnesses of the work on the cities, and in a way it's also one of the richnesses maybe of the seminar today, that people from different parts which not necessarily meet very often, they come together and exchange ideas, and that I think is really really important. I will be talking first a bit about kind of like trying to contrast the way economists see cities and what you think, which are, as I was saying, I think is very complementary. And then I'll be talking a bit about the systems of cities, because I think that's also very important. So, when economists looking at cities, they find the same thing. For example, when you look at GDP or productivity, basically you see that the productivity or GDP per capita increases when cities are bigger. But we also see that in part that's a sorting effect. That's in part because the more educated people tend to live in bigger cities. And so in a way, you're not really sure whether it's a genuine effect which is coming from people being in cities, or whether it's just kind of like all the most productive ones go to the cities, and then they end up being more productive than the smaller ones. So what economists then do, they go to microdata, and they try to control for these effects, so they take out all the individual effects of the people in a city. So the idea is basically, if they had the same education levels in all the cities in the world or here in the US, would the people in the bigger cities still be more productive? And when you do that, like for the US, you see that yes, that would be the case. And in the US, if you're not looking at the areas, if you're kind of like discounting the sorting, then what economists have been finding typically is that if your city size doubles, then the productivity goes up by something like around 10%, depending on the study, between 6 to 10% roughly. And when you take them out, then you get to something like more like 2 to 5% basically, and that's this kind of study. Here we've also been doing that, and we're getting a similar result of that basically. So that's a bit lower than what you have, and part of that I think is the sorting by education level, and the other part of that I think is because you're looking partly at income, and you also have a sorting that richer people tend to be in bigger cities, and so they have higher capital income. So there's also part of the income which is explained by another part of sorting. So I think that mainly explains the discrepancy what you have here. But then another. And that's what basically economists think, why you have agglomeration benefits, why people in cities are more productive. It comes down to learning, sharing, matching. I think most of you know that, so I'll just skip that, and those who don't, they can read that later. But what you also see is that we're not getting the same results in different countries. You're having the slope, you see, for example, the slope in the US, that's the blue one, is much steeper than in the other countries that we've been looking at, with the same technology, with the same definition of what an urban area is basically. And so there seems to be something else going on, and we don't really have conclusive evidence on that. But our idea why, for example, we think that this the slope is higher in the United States is because the cities are further apart, and so in a way they're not. So size is more important because you're not benefiting from nearby cities because there are none basically. And in other countries, and I'll be talking about the Netherlands, where cities are very close to each other, then you can get away by not being that big and still be productive. And so this first thing is the slopes are very different, and then but you also see there's a lot of variation there. And I have the impression economists are maybe a bit more concerned about the variation than physicists. For you, that's statistics. For us, that's kind of like reasons that we want to explore and kind of like try to find policies to kind of like help these ones which are below the line where they should be, and to basically get up to the line. And so we've been looking at these issues, and there's a lot of factors that may be explaining this variance. And I'll be focusing on two on which we've specifically worked. That's governance structures and this borrowed size that I was talking about. And what we find there is that really when you have fragmentation in metropolitan areas, and we measure that here as the number of municipalities, that really has a negative effect on the productivity and GDP per capita. And what we find is basically for a given population size, you double the number of municipalities. That has a negative effect on productivity by 6%. So that's quite sizable, actually. And we also then have been looking at the governance structures in cities. And if you have a governance body, we call this governance body, that means it's kind of like institution which kind of like takes a certain amount of decision at the metropolitan level, and where we think are the most important decisions to be taken at the metropolitan level are the ones concerning transport and spatial planning, then we see that this very strongly mitigates the negative effect from fragmentation. So on average, it's half by half, but I mean, then some of these governance structures are better than others, and we think that, I mean, if you have a very well-functioning one, you can probably mitigate the largest part of this negative effect from fragmentation. So that's one of the things, well, which explains part of the variation that you've seen, and that's something where certainly there is policy action that can be undertaken, and where this will then have a positive effect in the long term. And we don't think this happens overnight. I mean, it's something that you put in place this better governance structures, and that leads to better decisions, better policies, better transport systems, better land use planning, and via this, in the long term, you become more productive. The other point I wanted to talk about is borrowed size, and here what we did, we kind of like not only looked at their own population size of the city, but we also kind of like calculated, how many people are living in a certain area around the city. And what we roughly found is that basically the agglomeration benefits you get from the borrowed size is roughly half the ones than you get from your own population. And we looked at population living up to 300 kilometers around when we're doing these estimations. But what seems to be the most important borrowed size, borrowed agglomeration benefits you can get is from the people who are living somewhere around you where you can get like in 1 hour by public transport or by kind of cars as well, by transport basically. And to give you an example, the Netherlands, so that's a country which is fairly small, which doesn't have really big cities, but which has a lot of cities and which are relatively close to each other. And when you're doing, this chart for what I was showing you for the US earlier on, and the cities and whether kind of like productivity increase with population size, I mean, you actually see there's nothing to be seen. Actually, if you use all the dots there, I mean, basically the line is flat. Mm-hmm. So there's no agglomeration benefits in that size. But then if you look closer, you see there's these really small cities, which are typically between the two biggest Dutch agglomerations, between Amsterdam and Rotterdam, The Hague. And those places are really small population size, but they're extremely productive. And that's because they're benefiting from this borrowed size from the neighboring cities. And so if you leave them in, I mean, you don't get the agglomeration benefits, but if you control for that, I mean, then you get agglomeration benefits like everybody else. I also want to talk about a bit of systems of cities, because I think it's very important to consider cities itself as systems, but I mean, it's also to take into account that basically what happens in one city has an impact on the other cities in the country or in the economic region, basically. And for example, when you're improving the quality of life in a city, what does it mean, basically? That means it makes it more attractive to be in this specific city compared to the other cities in the country. And that means some people will be coming from the other cities to live in this city where just their activity was improved by either because you have better labor market possibilities or you have a better working transport system or whatever. But that means basically, I mean, given that people are moving away from the other systems, from the other cities in the system, then you have effects on those cities as well. I mean, you basically, if there's less people, you'll have less congestion and things like that. So, I mean, you really, decisions that you take in one place, decisions that are taken in Paris, for example, will have an impact on all the other large French cities. And that's something that's also important to understand. And that's also, I think, important to model. And in a way, I mean, this is a call to, I mean, everybody in the room, including myself, that I think we should be doing more work on systems of cities. I think that's very important. And I'm finishing just 1 minute, basically. One of the reasons why I think that really, I mean, cities work as a system is what economists refer to as Zipf's law. I think physicists may have another word for that. But, I mean, it's what it basically says, like in a country, I mean, your biggest city has a certain size, and then your next biggest city is half of the size. The third biggest city is 1/3 of the size, and then 1/4, 1/5, and so on goes on. And that's a law that's fairly universal, that holds, I mean, basically in most of the countries on this planet, that also if you go back in time, you also see that usually also holds. And it's also, for example, when you look at the European Union, when the European Union started if you're looking at the cities in the European Union, I mean, it didn't hold very well, but you see it over time as basically the countries have been integrating. The distribution of the city size in Europe has been converging towards the Zipf's law. So it seems to be a very dynamic process, a very strong universal law somehow. It's not that well understand why you got it, but it's just also to show that really we are talking about networks of cities, and this is really important. And that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Good.